What's going on YouTube? Tej back, and today we're talking about the Chicago Bears and my thoughts on their upcoming offseason. Let's jump into it. What's going on, everybody? Hopefully you're having a fantastic day. Before we get started, hopefully you will enjoy today's video. If you do, hit that like button and help me and my channel a ton. If you're new to the channel, be sure to hit that big red subscribe button. And of course, join me for a conversation down in the comment section. What do you think the Bears should do this offseason? What trades can they make? Should they move on from Khalil Mack? What can they do in the draft? No first round pick. Love to have your thoughts on all the things we're about to discuss down in the comment section. So obviously 6-11 season, the Bears missed the playoffs. They decided to fire Matt Nagy as well as former general manager Ryan Pace. Now it's Ryan Poles and Matt Eberflus with a job. So, you know, Nagy and Pace had a bad reputation, especially by the end of their tenure, but they did move up and take a guy in Justin Fields who could be potentially your first-round pick. That does make the life of Eberflus and Poles a little harder. No first-round pick this year. Only 5 picks to work with, so that's a little tough. But what is the most exciting thing going on in Chicago right now? It is the fact that this team has Justin Fields, which in and of itself, a huge deal for this franchise. They've been looking for a franchise type of dude. And Field has the making of that guy, and they got him at a really nice spot at 11. Did have to move up for him, but I'm totally in support of that trade. Now, what makes this team kind of tricky to move forward with, and you compare it to some of the other teams we've already done in the series, teams leading up to this have been either like bad Carolina, where you don't have a whole lot of cap space, have some good players, but missing at the most important position, odds are you're not going to be that good. Or it's the Buffalo Bills, and hey, really good team. You don't have a lot of cap space because you paid your stars, and now you're just kind of looking to see what incremental edges you can try to move forward with, and we might be able to get a little cheaper. What type of veterans might sign for cheap, that type of stuff. The Bears' second-year quarterback rookie deal, you're thinking, hey, this team should have a lot of money to spend, which they're in a good spot for projected usable cap space, 12th in the league. That's a healthy place, but you look at Chargers are top 4 in the league. The Bengals have a ton of money to spend, and then there's Chicago, who, year 2 of Fields versus year 3 for those other guys. Yeah, they still have some work to do. And it's one of those things where I don't think the Chicago Bears will do this, but if you assess the Bears' path to a Super Bowl and you look at it in a straight line from A to B, the quickest way there is probably moving on from Khalil Mack, not bringing back Robert Quinn or trading him if you can. And honestly, it's probably 3 years, and in 3 years with really good off seasons and great coaching from Eberflus and new offensive coordinator Luke Getsy, it's going to take a lot for those guys for this team in 3 years to be legitimate Super Bowl contenders. So you look at even Roquan Smith, upper 20s, makes a lot of money. In 3 years' time, that's probably a player they're even looking to move on from, because he's a linebacker in his 30s making a ton of money. Got to move on from that. You got to be able to use that money elsewhere. So it's interesting. You look at that core that has made that defense so good, and Akeem Hicks is a free agent. What do they do moving forward on that side of the football? And of course, Eberflus, former defensive coordinator with the Colts, he did a lot with a little in my eyes, right? Like DeForest Buckner, one of the best pass rushing DTs in the league. Not taking that away. Quiddy Pay, a nice rookie. Darius Leonard's a turnover-making machine. Dude's unbelievable. What I'm really fascinated about with the Eberflus hire is he did a lot with that secondary, with guys and investments made by the Colts that really weren't big splash moves. Like Corey Willis, Justin Blackmon were not guys on a ton of people's radars prior to Eberflus' tenure as the DC. And now they're considered some of the best guys at that position. And you look at Eberflus getting, call it a renaissance year out of Xavier Rhodes. Rock Ya-Sin has been a disappointment in a lot of Colts fans' eyes, but he's still a solid starting caliber quarterback because of the defense they play, lots of cover too. And that, in relationship with Eddie Jackson and knowing what he has been in the past, is a really fascinating fit. Can Eberflus tap back into prime Eddie Jackson and have him just flying around the field, creating chaos left and right? Now, we'll talk more about that safety position once we get into free agency, which is where we're going next. So you look at $19.5 basically $1 million worth of work with, and potentially more. Obviously, restructures are going to come into effect, and maybe this team does trade a Khalil Mack and get a first-round pick or something like that. Replenish where they might be short on draft capital by moving on a guy who was in his 30s and one of the best edge rushers in football, but did have a season-ending injury a year ago. But for me, bring back James Daniels. He's a guard in his mid-20s. He's already a solid football player. Because of his age, there's room for him to continue to get better. And especially, going from a situation with Matt Nagy where it felt like this team was kind of stagnant, and as players got older, they just kind of stayed the same, but because players were getting older and leaving in free agency, they ultimately just got worse and worse in the record department. I'd bring back James Daniel. Maybe a change in coaching staff will help tap into a little bit more what he could be. But this offensive line, it got better as the year went on. Like Larry Bourne was better than I had anticipated, and Jason Peters held up outside of when he faced Myles Garrett, which we were saying all last year about whoever he was lined up against, and Tevin Jenkins was used on the field, looked pretty solid, got to see him a little bit at both tackle spots. So there are pieces to work with there, but this offensive line can definitely get better. That said, I don't think they're in a spot to lose a good, young, promising offensive lineman, right? So it's already a position of need across the offensive line. Why let a good one go? So I would try to prioritize James Daniels and bringing him back. Now, to be fair, if someone's going to go out there and throw him, $10+ million a year, then you're probably thinking about it saying like, okay, well, that's not a great value for a guy who hasn't necessarily played up to the billings of $10 million. That's what Ali Marpet was making before he retired. So is Daniels Marpet? No. So then at that price point you might think about it. But for anything less, I'd really strongly consider bringing him back. And then the next point, and this even coincides with some of what I'm talking about with the draft of this team. I think you double dip at the wide receiver spot. I have a hard time thinking they're going to convince Allen Robinson coming back. So I think you need two of them. Right? Darnell Moody's a nice guy, but he has proven to me that if I had covered that NFL draft, he would have been in that tier 3 for me, where really nice 3, interesting 2. I think he's stepped up into that tier 2 for my eyes, where he can be a high end number 2 wide receiver, but you still need that number 1. And considering no first round pick, I don't know if you're necessarily going to get one. A lot of mocks have been putting David Bell. I think Bell's probably in that tier 2, could be a high end number 2 depending on who he has opposite of him. But that said, a Bell and a Darnell Moody, nice different compatibilities in regards to how they win and where they win on the field. But I think this team needs to address it in both free agency and in the draft. So they can get a young guy in the draft, cost controlled, and maybe in free agency it's not a Chris Godwin or bringing back an Allen Robinson. Maybe it's someone like a Sammy Watkins. I just feel like this team needs to continue to have that veteran presence around. And when we got to see Sammy Watkins, specifically in the front half of last year, he didn't look terrible, right? So depending on what wide receiver they like, I just think there is something to be had about having an older guy in the room to work with Mooney and potentially who they go with in the NFL draft. But in free agency, you've got to find a guy who can be that Allen Robinson replacement, assuming you don't bring him back. Then I would add one more guy in the draft, especially considering you're talking, day 2 of the NFL draft when I'm saying target wide receiver. I think prioritizing a guy in free agency, try to bring a more well-balanced attack on the outside, because odds are with your cap space, you're not signing a Devontae Adams, right? You're probably not going to even get a Mike Williams, who, there's question marks there about how, legit of a number 1 is he. So maybe it's a collection of, hey, we got David Bell in round 2 and we signed, Sammy Watkins. Across the board, we have a lot of 2s basically, but we can work with that. And then, kind of the work falls to the shoulders of Luke Getsy. Like, how do I help get these guys open? How do I make Justin Fields' life a little easier? Stuck on that point a little longer than I anticipated. But final point, find a split safety to pair with Eddie Jackson. A lot of too high looks for Matt Eberflus. And Eddie Jackson, I think, can play that split safety role. We've already seen him kind of play in multiple spots. Lots of free safety over the past couple of years, but I don't think they're there. That is because he can't play in and around the line of scrimmage. But having him be able to do a little bit of everything in those 2 high looks is really interesting to me. Now, again, cap comes into effect because, I'd say, hey, sign Marcus Williams, and that safety duo would be filthy, right? It's not that easy, right? You don't have unlimited space to work with here. So, Marcus May, Marcus Williams, Tyrann Mathieu, more than likely off the table. So, maybe it is bringing back Tajon Gibson. Maybe it is bringing back Deion Bush. Or maybe it's someone like an Anthony Harris, primarily a free safety. Quandre Diggs, primarily a free safety. So I don't know if those are perfect fits, but those are just a couple of names that I think will be a little bit cheaper. You also have Terrell Edmonds. Not in love with what he could do in coverage, but maybe Eddie Jackson makes up for that. There's a lot of good talent at the safety position in this year's free agency class, and because of that, there's probably going to be names that linger around, and maybe Chicago can get them for a cheaper deal than maybe if it was less supply in the safety class. So I think there might be a bargain to be had there for the Bears, and I think that's a position worth investing in. But that said, Matt Eberflus also got a lot out of Kari Willis and Justin Blackman, who weren't on people's radar. So maybe it's instead, like, hey, go out there and let's get a Jaquan Brisker in round 2, and let's pair him with Eddie Jackson. That could be a really interesting fit. Speaking of the draft, obviously no first-round pick. It would be great if this team had one because, there's a lot of really good tackles. There's some good interior offensive line depth. If you don't bring back a James Daniels, There's a lot of good safeties. There's a lot of good corners, and I love some of these corners pairing up opposite of Jalen Johnson. I could take that defense to the next level, but for right now, no first-round pick, and I put, take a trade to get there. And Khalil Mack's the one that immediately comes to mind. Maybe a Roquan Smith too, but he's a little younger, and I could see them wanting to keep him around. Mack is really the one that I don't think he does get traded, but seems like the most likely candidate. Day 2, I'd go wide receiver, offensive line. As much as this team has a good defense and they hired a defensive coordinator, it feels like that is done as a way to try to maximize what they know is a side of the ball that's going to have some diminishing assets and resources on its side. And it's almost kind of like what the Ravens are going through now, where they've put so much onto the defense, and now you're about to have to pay Lamar Jackson, and the Bears are going to try to figure out if Justin Fields is their long-term guy. So the investments are now going to be coming on the offensive side. So you're going to start to see the money flip from one end of the field to the other, basically. And for Chicago, considering you have limited assets, you got to see what Justin Fields is. Can you make this work? Wide receiver round 1, offensive line in round 3, maybe the other way around, right? If Zion Johnson falls to you or Kenyon Green comes to you at 35, jump on it, then go wide receiver like Jalen Tolbert, Christian Watson, or something like that in round 3. I think there's some room to play with those two position groups on day 2. And then once you get to day 3, I think there's going to be some holdover at the linebacker position. I think there's some safeties who could matriculate into day 3. And think about like Jabril Cox last year falling to the top of the 4th round for the Cowboys. It wasn't a position in need for Dallas, but they saw a guy who largely had been mocked and projected to be a day 2 player, and they said, hey, let's go take this. And, look at this. Like, a lot of people are mocking first-round linebacker. Maybe Jabril Cox is the guy in the future for Dallas. So I think Chicago picking towards especially the top of round 4, don't go in saying we need to get better at this position. Go in and say, hey, this guy was largely considered a round 2, maybe a early round 3 type of dude. He's still here on day 3. Let's go BPA. That's where I would start. And then after that, you got to get younger at edge and corner. And like I said, Thomas Graham is a nice player. I don't actually know if I mentioned in this video, but they hit on Thomas Graham in the 6th last year. He is better than a 6th-round pick. And I was saying that a season ago, but he still fell. And he looked pretty good when we got to see him towards the end of the year. And, Khalil Herbert, this team did a fantastic job picking in the back of the NFL draft, honestly. But get younger at edge and corner. And this is another one of those teams, kind of like I talked about with Carolina last video, or in this series at least. Embrace projects, because you're in a spot now where resources are limited. And if you have the opportunity for a guy in the 5th, 6th, 7th, that comes with some risk, but if it works out, he's more akin to someone who should have gone in the 1st, or a top 64 player, basically a top 2 round type of talent. Once we get some retrospective looks on this class, that's totally worth it. And if it doesn't work out, then whatever, you wasted a 5th or 6th. So I think Chicago's in a spot where, take some risks. Find some projects you like at the edge, and specifically the cornerback position. Maybe guys who aren't fully refined. Put them in the hands of your coaches. Give them something to do, and try to see what you can tap into. Final notes. Any and all resources need to go to Fields. You've got to see what he truly is. And if you put in enough around the ecosystem and Fields still doesn't look good, and Eberflus and Getz are like, hey, you know what? The processing is too slow. He's just not a franchise quarterback. Well, okay, you did your due diligence and you found out soon enough to where only you in the room know that. And, maybe there's tape out there. Obviously teams are going to watch other games. So maybe you can't get a first-round pick for Justin Fields, but you can move on from him. And there's going to be teams that want to trade for that type of former first-round pick, former top 11 guy, and then make that their project, and you get some assets back. Or the alternative is you put pieces around him, he proves he's a franchise guy, and despite where the defense might get older, you're losing Akeem Hicks. If the offense takes a massive step forward and you get great quarterback play, the holes in the defense are going to become way less concerning than they are if you're playing with a bad quarterback, an offense that only puts up 14 points a game or something like that. And the final note in the final notes, get younger on defense. You have to anticipate Khalil Mack is not going to, if this team is playing the Super Bowl in 5 years, Khalil Mack more than likely not on that team. Roquan Smith might be a bit of a stretch. Robert Quinn's probably not on the roster at that point. And that's the same thing I've been saying about Akeem Hicks. I've been saying they should trade him because 3 to 5 years' time, he's not playing on a potential Super Bowl Bears roster. So get younger and try to be ahead of the curve for where those holes might land up in years to come. But that is going to do it for my Chicago Bears offseason checklist. Tell me what you think this team can do to improve their roster not only this year but down the line, because this team does have a really high ceiling moving forward depending on what Justin Fields becomes. Love to have your thoughts for what they can make and do on the offensive side to make Fields' life easier, but also how they can replenish some of their talent that might be going by the wayside on the defensive side. Hopefully you all enjoyed today's video. If you did, hit that like button. It would help me and my channel out a ton. And if you're new around here, be sure to hit that big red subscribe button. That's going to do it for me. Hope you all have a fantastic rest of your day. Until next time, my name is Teej, and I'm signing off.